Hey there, Law and Econ class, chapter 6, part 3. Here we go. In the last chapter, we ended with a diagram that took a look at the way we conceptualize compensation with the tort. Individual had their health and their wealth impacted, and a couple things. One, if you can actually restore their health, we saw how we can get back to the initial point, perhaps, that we were on the first indifference curve, U2. If their health cannot be restored, we can still get them conceptually to indifference curve U2, but with a higher monetary award to compensate for the lack of health. So how about real world issues related to that? Well, the loss of income, even future medical costs, are not that difficult to quantify. But how about pain and suffering? Because one of the elements that comes up, sometimes very significantly with the tort, is going to be the ongoing pain that someone's going to suffer every day of their life. And how do you go ahead and value it? The one thing you're not allowed to do in court is to say to the jury, what if it happened to you? That will cause a mistrial, okay? That's extremely prejudicial. So you have to put it in some sort of terms that jurors can understand. One thing that I have seen clients do a few times in the past is they've asked me to make a calculation of, let's say, $100 a day for the remainder of someone's life. So they would say, okay, if you could pay $100 a day to not have this pain for the rest of your life, how much would that cost in terms of present value? Because we have to remember, awards from a jury almost exclusively, there's only a small exception with medical malpractice cases, the awards are going to be made now. So we have to do everything in terms of the present value of what the loss happens to be, looking however far into the future with the loss of earnings or future medical costs or an impact on someone's retirement, pension, etc., out to their life expectancy. Now, so how do we quantify pain and suffering? Ideally, it would be an amount, one way to think about it would be, how much would you accept right now for somebody to do that to you? So let's say you were well and you're looking at someone who's got ongoing back pains forever. How much money would you require for someone to injure you such that you had those kinds of pains? Okay. That would be a pretty tough one to be sure. And even there, that's not going to be a perfect measure of the loss because it was involuntarily done to the individual. It wasn't a voluntary action. Okay. Another complication that arises in thinking about damages, we haven't even gotten to precaution and apportioning liability and stuff like that yet, but just thinking about the damages associated with an accident is sometimes the law is structured so that compensation actually is kind of perverse in a way, in ways that you normally wouldn't think about. Let me give you a couple of examples. One would be the death of a child, okay? The family actually saves the cost of raising and educating that child. So if you are trying to quantify it, and most of the time in the death of a child, it's simply going to be pain and suffering that's argued to the jury, and you leave it to them to determine how much would be an appropriate amount to, you can't bring someone back, but money is our only justice in a situation like that. The one exception that I've seen is where you might have in some cultures the child, particularly the eldest child, may have a responsibility in terms of taking care of the parents into their old age. And in circumstances like that, we may actually view the household as having multiple parts. And one, let's say you've got a child with two parents, we would view that as a 3-person household. We would estimate the earnings that the child would have had, relying on whatever best evidence we have to try and project that. and then we would take away an estimate of how much the person who died would have spent on themselves. Because most states, California is one of them, is a loss of support state. So when someone passes away, the measure is not how much money did they earn, what were their benefits, etc., but how much did they earn minus an estimate of the amount they would have paid on themselves, how they would have spent on themselves, and so what would have been left over to support the household. Some states, you take taxes into account. Other states, you do not take taxes into account. California is one of the states you don't take taxes into account. It's totally a legal issue. One more point I want to share with you is in a household, and those of you in my labor econ class or who have taken labor econ before will know really well, in a household, you're typically spending out of the household's income, okay? So let's just give an example. A spouse making $50,000 a year dies, but their spouse was making $250,000 a year. So the question becomes, 250 and 50, together they made $300,000 a year. Do you base the consumption of the person who died on the $50,000 that they earned only, or the $300,000 from the household? If it's the $300,000 from the household, even with a smaller percentage for spending by that person who passed away, you're going to have a much bigger amount that person would have spent on themselves than if we only looked at the $50,000 that they earned in a two-person household or more if you have minor children. California does not allow you to consider the earnings of a spouse. Other states absolutely do, and that could dramatically lower the losses depending upon whether the person who died was the major breadwinner or the minor breadwinner. Okay, one final complication I want to talk about, and then we're going to get into some other justice issues, and that is the situation where you have the death of a non-working or retired spouse, particularly, let's say, a non-working spouse, let's say in their 30s. Well, the family saves on the amount of money that spouse would have spent year after year after year. So you have to be very careful in terms of trying to craft a damage analysis in a circumstance like that. What I typically have been asked to do and suggest to my clients to do is to simply value the household services that they provided, the cooking, the cleaning, the shopping, the bill paying, the repairing, all of the things to enable a household to run. And on that kind of stuff, the amount that someone does strictly for their own benefit's pretty minor. So that's the one way to get sort of a halfway decent damage number in that particular circumstance. Okay. Clearly, because of the non-economic nature of compensation in a tort litigation suffers from something that we call liability disparity. Liability disparity is another way of saying that different jurisdictions, different courthouses, different cities, different states are likely to be more favorable or less favorable to the plaintiff in a situation like that, and it could demonstrably lower the value of an award. Let me give you some examples. Ventura County, historically, the courthouse is up in Ventura, is a difficult place for plaintiffs to win. Jurors tend to be conservative. They don't want plaintiffs acting as if they're here to win the lotto. And so that is a tough place to get a big verdict. Sometimes it happens, but you have to have a really compelling case for that to happen. I did a case a number of years ago. It was actually an employment case, and my client said, and was up in Ventura, and they said, I will never take another case in Ventura County. I get it. Right? Other examples of places that have been bad, in a sense, Pomona, kind of conservative. That's the eastern end of LA County. Santa Monica, well-educated jury pool, and they tend to be suspicious. and they're not there to sock it to the defendant as a reflex action, and so that's a tough place. Fresno, very tough. Bakersfield, very tough. Any place where people either are really well educated but lean to the conservative side, or places where people may not be that well educated but generally are more conservative, it's a little tougher to get a good verdict. Palm Springs, very tough house. You have a lot of retirees there. They worked all their lives really hard to earn that retirement, and they don't want to see someone just get some big fat award and not have to worry about working for the rest of their life. Okay, we'll pick this up in part 4.